It didn't stop Bach, though, from going on writing. He wrote with great energy, with great conviction, and some of his greatest works do indeed come at the end of his life. In this respect, he is no different from other giants such as Mozart and Beethoven who came shortly after him. And also, like those men, his art became slightly more abstract, not necessarily endearing him to the public more as he got older. He was, as it were, distilling his art, realizing that he could say more with less notes as he got older. But the one thing that really distinguished Bach from his predecessors was that he seemed to become increasingly aware, as he went on in years, that he was going to pass on his art as a legacy to the future. Now, that was not the standard way to think at all. People were quite satisfied to have their art enjoyed and played during their lifetime, but they didn't usually go to great lengths to make a body of their music available in fair copy. And with Anna Magdalena at his side, he made fair copies of much of his music, thereby giving us the idea that he realized that real appreciation of his art was going to come much later in his life. And I would have to say that the revival of Bach's music is still going on today. In fact, it is much more possible to get good editions of Bach's music now, for my students, than it was for me to get those editions when I was a student, not so very long ago. You see, when Bach's music was revived in the 19th century, editors pounced on it and said, well, we're going to try to fix this up, arrange it, make it a little bit more palatable for modern tastes. And so they tried to help the great man out. Well, there's nothing like gilding the lily, and in the case of Bach, it was truly an insult because his music was so magnificent that it didn't need any help or any window dressing of any kind. And yet, it is these editions done by well-meaning editors who really loved his music that were passed down to us and that were the standard still that you could buy at the music store when I was a kid learning the violin repertoire. We only later on saw the real thing in all its simplicity, in all its beauty. We realized that Bach did not expect his music to have so much physical power, that the power was more intellectual and spiritual. We realized that Bach didn't expect us to press our instruments so intensely, but rather to try to coax a more transparent, gentle sound out of the instrument, thereby laying bare the many layers of counterpoint that are in this music. Still to this day, as I go around the country and in other parts of the world and give master classes, I find that people play Brahms, and they play Shostakovich, and they play Alban Berg with great understanding in comparison to Bach. Then comes the Bach music in a master class. I listen to it, and I have to start saying, now, just a moment, there are some things about this music that you really don't understand. You're getting in the way. They usually blink when I say that, the students. They say, what do you mean? I say, your violin is too present. Your personality is too present. It must be a simpler, more limpid kind of sound, a cleaner attack, a greater attention to the simple articulations that Bach had in the music, which is required. And then with that simplicity, you, the performer, will start to disappear, to go away, and I will be able to hear the majesty and the power of this music behind the physical presence of your playing it. It is that simplicity which still makes Bach's art as great as any art that has ever been written in the Western civilization. If you look carefully at this very dignified statue of Bach, you find some rather odd things. Do you see the pocket there that is hanging out? This strange second button, which is unbuttoned. What do these things mean? Perhaps the artist who made this statue was trying to show how poor Bach was. How poor was he, really? Not that poor. He was actually in the upper class of his society at the time. He was well paid for what he did, not perhaps at the level that the quality of his output would indicate. The reason for this empty pocket is that it's simply a notion of the Romantic era. When this sculptor made the statue, he wanted to show the poor artist Bach
and make you feel sorry for him. That was a romantic notion, not a Baroque one at all. He also had the button unbuttoned to show that indeed he was an artist who had the right to appear with his neck open and not with the collar closed, as he would have had to do if he were not a musician. This, again, is from a completely different time and smacks more of Beethoven or even of Lord Byron than it does of Bach. But if Bach had no cause to complain about poverty, he rightly grumbled about his lack of recognition and fame. He must have felt slighted, seeing the engravings and portraits of Telemann and Handel, knowing that there were none of him. Indeed, the only authentic likeness we have of him is the Haussmann portrait. Bach commissioned it when he was 62 as a requirement for his acceptance into the Society of Musical Sciences. These are the sorts of buildings, and this is the sort of street that Bach would have known well as he walked back and forth, discharging his daily duties. He often came directly down this street to visit Zimmermann's Café. It had long been a gathering place for artists and musicians. 25 years before Bach arrived in Leipzig, Telemann had started a Collegium Musicum here. It attracted both amateur and professional musicians who got together informally to play music they enjoyed. Here, Bach was not under pressure to compose a new work each week as he had been doing in the churches. In fact, he was really in a state of artistic exhaustion from the efforts of the previous 6 or 7 years, where he had composed so many cantatas, and presumably his superiors in the town didn't even realize the nature of his efforts. Instead, now he could come here, enjoy himself, sit with fellow musicians, and make music in a much more relaxed atmosphere.
Große Hochzeit, große Freude, große Wege, große Scheide. Große Lichter, große Bütte, große Hunde, große Knittel, große Väter, große Söhne, große Goschen, große Zähne. Große Pfeile, große Köche, große Nasen, große Löcher. Große Herren, große Wappen, große Fässer, große Zacken. Große Gäste, große Körner, große Köpfe, große Hörner. Große Hafer, große Trespen, große Pferde, große Wespen. Große Weiber, große Frauen, große Weiber, große Frauen. Große Kuchen, große Kühe, große Bauern, große Fliegel. Große Jungfern, große Kränze, große Riesen, große Schwänze. Große Lachen, große Getatsche, große Frauen, große Geklatsche, große Klöppel, große Trommel, große Wespen, große Hummel, große Wespen, große Hummel, große Leinwand, große Bleiche, große Fabrik, große Teiche.
The Collegium Musicum also performed for special occasions. When Frederick Augustus, Elector of Saxony, visited Leipzig in 1734, Bach whipped together on only 3 days' notice a cantata praising the monarch. The Elector and his entourage watched from the balcony of this Renaissance house, owned by the wealthy merchant Appel. 600 torchbearers marched down Catherine Street. Meanwhile, 2 choirs paraded from opposite directions. The town chronicler recorded the event.
They finally faced each other in the market square within sight of Appel's house. Bach, as director, stood in the middle. The whole town was lit up. The Rathaus Tower and the balcony were decked out with colored lamps. The lights lasted until midnight. People came in from the country to see it, and His Royal Majesty and His Royal Consort did not leave the windows until the music was over, and listened most graciously, and liked it well.
A sad footnote to the event was that the town trumpeter, Gottfried Reiche, exhausted and overcome by the fumes of the torches, collapsed and died the next day. At what point in Bach's life did he become really aware of his desire to lay down a legacy